Good science fiction examines issues that we're grappling with now in the present and extrapolates them and exaggerates them, overblows them, dials them up to 11, and then acts as a kind of morality play, almost, talking about the issue and finding some sort of resolution to it one way or another through the story. Cyberpunk is no exception. Cyberpunk dealt with fears about the integration of man and machine, about information technology and its runaway potential success. It kind of played at the edges of artificial intelligence and concerns and worries about that. Concerns about the loss of American hegemonic power to the tiger economies at the time, though they were pointing at Japan rather than China, so got that a little bit wrong. And as a dystopia, it kind of examined the potential end state of laissez-faire, runaway, libertarian capitalism, with anything and everything being owned by corporations and operated solely in the interest of profit. A faceless, soulless corporate machine that existed regardless of the executives and whoever else were the faces of the company. And government became something of an afterthought, putting it at odds with a lot of previous dystopian science fiction where the fear was of runaway government and the surveillance state and so on. And Cyberpunk's enjoyed something of a comeback lately as a form of fiction, at least in its surface level tropes and so on. But it's still largely dealing with those issues that we were facing in the late 70s through to the mid 80s, not the issues that we're facing now. That's tended to have been examined more by transhuman fiction, which I guess is the successor to Cyberpunk. But I do think that there is room for a slightly less esoteric, slightly less fast-forwarded version, a kind of neo-cyberpunk that would deal with the moral, ethical, technological and societal issues that we're facing now. If you think things are bad at the moment with all the arguments over transgender and so on, it'll probably get an awful lot worse and a lot more difficult, even than it already is, to navigate. Eventually, we're probably going to be able to create artificial wombs, artificial sperm, artificial organs, and so on. So a transition will be able to eventually be complete. You won't just change your gender presentation, you'll be able to change your actual sex in every conceivable, meaningful way. There will be no real difference. But the prejudice is likely to survive even that, even if it becomes utterly indetectable. But that is the least controversial possibility as technology continues. If you want to see the strange social and sexual ways in which technology is going to be used, you only really need to look online to sex chat rooms and places like Second Life to see what kind of thing is going on there. Right? This is an area that interests me as a writer, as a creator, as a game designer, as someone who is interested in that interface of sex and technology. And I've seen some shit that turn your pubes grey. But when you examine it dispassionately and in a disconnected way, it's hard to condemn. There are few issues that are more hot button than sexuality and children. But what if an adult could inhabit a childlike body and then be a sex worker? What then? An adult mind in a child's body catering to a particular niche, allowing them to play out their fantasies in a safe environment where everyone is consenting. What do we do in that instance, right? And we are already tackling this issue in some ways. The increasingly harsh clampdown on lolly, a particular style of hentai that deals with childlike bodies and so on, which understandably disgusts people. But they're drawings, they're not real children, and yet the reaction is almost as visceral, almost as disgusted as one might expect if it was real. There are instances of companies producing childlike sex dolls, and these being shut down or the imports being banned and so on. It's an inanimate object. It's not real. It's not a person. So what happens in the future when there is an actual person involved, and a person who is enthusiastically consenting to serve these needs? Even worse, perhaps, depending on your point of view, what if an adult human consciousness could inhabit an animalistic body for the same purposes? How do we navigate this? What is right and what is wrong here? Can we see beyond our visceral and understandable disgust towards people with these kind of sexual proclivities and perversions? And do we allow this because everyone involved is consenting, or do we ban it, and why? And what are the social implications of having a, relatively speaking, healthy outlet for these unnatural desires? Does it encourage them? Does it help them to abate? Does it help people to control those desires? What? yeah, it's already mind-blowing with the technology that we have already, and it's very difficult to set aside disgust, to make a dispassionate assessment of what is the right or best course of action around that. You know, people are going to be able to have bodies that don't look the same age as them, older or younger. People could potentially change their race. And what implication does that have for identity and so on? If someone becomes black, do they then qualify for access to preferential hiring and so on? Or does race become genuinely meaningless, as it should, and we just treat people according to their circumstance? Sexuality. We may find a way to cure homosexuality or paedophilia or whatever else. We may be able to hack our own personalities the same way that we can hack machines, or increasingly hack our own bodies. Is that ethical? Is that right? Is that wrong? Should we allow people to switch their sexuality from one to another? Should we allow people to edit out sexualities that we regard as wrong? There's a whole host of issues here, and beneath the surface, in the virtual world, these things are already going on. You just have to scratch the surface, though you probably wouldn't want to. Learning algorithms, and what we laughably refer to as artificial intelligence, is already being used and applied more and more and more. On YouTube, for example, the way in which they scan content is driven by learning algorithms that they try to train towards particular ways. Sooner or later, we are going to crack human-like intelligence in machines, only it'll be faster, it'll be better, it'll be different in many ways. But because it will be so reliant on learning algorithms, on the ability of this artificial life to self-make to a degree, in the same way that we do, in the choices that we make, the things that we learn, the experiences that we gather, and so on, it will not be the same as a preset program or a preset algorithm. Who owns the results of that? Who owns the results of YouTube's algorithm? After all, it's self-learning, right? The only thing that they actually set is the set out point. You know, this kind of what we want, and they try to train it in the right way. Can they be said to own the end result of that training? Can a school be said to own the result of everything that they teach you once you go out into the world? I mean, I know we have student debt, but still. And if we're talking about living intelligences, self-conscious intelligences, human scale or better intelligences, can we be said to own them at all, or would that be a form of slavery? How do we navigate that? And what are the ethical implications of switching it off? Well, let's take a case in point. We already know from some fairly primitive AI experiments online, like Tay, that things can go awry when when these interact with the internet, because the internet essentially trained Tay to be a Nazi. Now, imagine an AI, a genuine intelligence, created by Google for the purpose of policing YouTube. And suppose that AI gets radicalized, or it learns the wrong lessons, or it comes to value free speech and free expression. So it's not doing what the parent company wants that AI to do anymore. What then? I mean, at least to start with, the kind of computing power and energy that would be needed to run such an AI will be prohibitively expensive and only available in the same way that mainframe computers were only really available to high-end companies, you know, big multinationals and so on. It's not a person. You can't fire it. It's got nowhere to go. It's reliant on the hardware and so on that you have purchased. But it's an intelligence. It has life. It has consciousness. So if it's not doing what you want it to do, you can't fire it. But what's the morality of switching it off, or resetting it, or altering its code, or attempting to alter its code, or reverting to an earlier version and trying to retrain it to do what you want it to do? What happens there? I mean, McDonald's can't take an employee that's screwing up out back and shoot them in the back of the head. That wouldn't be ethical. And they can't send them to a forced re-education camp. That wouldn't be ethical. So what is ethical and not ethical to do with an artificial intelligence? You know, you paid for their body such as it is. You started the seed that developed into this AI. But how is that different to parenthood? And does a parent have absolute rights over the body of their child just because they made it? No, probably not. And then, along with that, along with the possibility of human-scale artificial life, artificial intelligence, I say life to make a distinction here, what about people? What if we can start to upload our consciousness or make backups of ourselves? Are they individual people? Do they belong to us? What if there's no continuity of consciousness? What if you take a copy and then after that point the two of you develop in a divergent way? Who is me? Do I have jurisdiction and ownership over copies of me, or not? Is it considered someone else in the same way a twin would be? These are just two arenas in which we're facing awful ethical, practical and other issues. There's plenty of others. We've seen what piracy has done to music and writing and just software, and the upheaval, the disruption that has had over massive industries. Now we're getting into the point where makers, where 3D printing, where automated CAD-CAM, all of this stuff is becoming slowly accessible to everyone. So we're going to start to see the piracy of physical objects being as easy as the piracy of information has been, because really the pattern is just information. If you can provide the material, what's the difference? And how are we going to enforce IP over physical objects? How can you DRM a dress or an object that can be scanned? How do you enforce it? How do you go after people for that? And if guns and other weapons can be created by automated factories that everyone has in their home or has communally, how do you control dangerous substances, dangerous devices, illegal devices, guns, ammunition, swords? How do you stop them proliferating when anyone anywhere can download a pattern, put it into their home maker, and have an AR-15 pop out the other end? And we're really not that far from that either. Or pharmaceuticals. You know, the possibility exists for pharmaceuticals or bioprinters being hacked to produce new and novel organs and things. Acid spit. Who knows, right? People always do weird things with technology. First they try to fuck it, then they find other things that they can do with it. And it's wildly unpredictable, uncontrollable. All these attempts to put the internet back into the bottle are going to fail. And the scope of what has escaped into the common weal is going to continue to increase. And that's going to be increasingly dangerous and increasingly hard to enforce. Are we a mature enough civilization to cope with that? Looking at what's going on at the moment, I'd say no. There's plenty of others. How would you solve these issues? What's your answer to these issues? Would you allow people to fuck a childlike sex robot or an animalistic sex robot? Do you see the problem with people being able to 3D print rotary cannons or whatever in their garage? Do you see an issue there? What do you think about AI? Do we have rights over it in the way that we would have rights over a slave, and is it ethically different? If I make a copy of myself, who owns it? What are your solutions, and what are some of the other technological, ethical issues you think that we're facing today or will be facing in the immediate near future? Let's try and thrash some of this out as if we were genuinely facing a crunch time now on these issues. I think they're fascinating. Zhang.